thank you very much for doing the homework and reading all of this Vladimir Putin for us. And what you've presented from it has been completely enlightening to me, every line of it. You make the point that Vladimir Putin, in his writing, is including, in effect, a presentation of propaganda, a presentation of the way he wants to be seen. How does he want to be seen?
Well, one thing he's fixated on in his writings is the fear of Russian decline. It's something he denies and he laments all at the same time. In all his rhetoric and propaganda, it's all about life and death for Russia. So his concerns about NATO expansion is part of that, but really it's been part of his story for a long time. Just before he took over the presidency in late 1999, he published something called his Millennium Message, sort of this lengthy manifesto. And his big concern at the time is that Russia would slide into second or third tier status. So he projects himself as the man who can prevent that, who can restore Russia to the greatness that he thinks was robbed from it at the end of the Cold War.
You also describe his history of being not a good communicator, which continues to this day, as we've seen in some of these rambling speeches that he's given. You write, according to First Person, his KGB instructors found him withdrawn and tight-lipped, and even his former wife understood him so poorly that when he was proposing marriage, she thought he was breaking things off. How did such a poor communicator get control of the Russian government?
Well, that's a really interesting story, sort of part of the history of Vladimir Putin. He was, he wasn't considered to be necessarily, a big up and comer after he came back to Russia. After the fall of the wall, after the end of the Cold War, he had a not super high level job working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. But there is one detail that I think is very telling of how he sees himself, how he saw himself even at the time. One of his colleagues, and this is quoted in the book First Person that was published in 2000, one of his colleagues pointed out that all the people working in those offices had the standard portrait of Boris Yeltsin, up on the wall. Vladimir Putin specifically requested a portrait of Peter the Great. He sort of liked to think of himself in those very grandiose terms. He's constantly talking in his writings about his sense of historical mission. He's someone who imagined that the restoration of Russian power was his mission as a figure in the world, and of course the end of the Soviet Union was, to his mind, a great tragedy.
So you also note that last July he published an essay where he said what he has said since invading Ukraine. The essay was titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. The two nations are really one people, sharing a faith, culture, and language," he asserts, and modern Ukraine is little more than a creation of the Soviet era. That is almost word for word what he said after invading Ukraine.
Yes, you see a lot of echoes in his writing. I mean, clearly the status of Ukraine is something that he's been fixated on for a long time. He sees them as really one nation, one language, one culture. Clearly the Ukrainians don't see it this way. But he also sees this as a way of really restoring the losses at the end of the Cold War. One of the things that he talks about in his writings is that these things were just taken away from, that the Soviet republics were taken away from their historic motherland. He talks of it more as a reunification than an invasion, almost as if he's just taking back what was sort of unlawfully dispossessed.
And he talks about memories of childhood, of dealing with bullies and other things that give us, and he does it in present tense in ways that give you the feeling that this is the way he is as a strategist.
Yes, he talks about when he was in school. He, you know, at the same time that he brags about his high school grades, which seems like a weird thing for any adult to do, let alone someone like him. He talks about how, you know, he liked to be the unspoken leader. That's when he felt comfortable in school. And even as he did well in his classes, you know, he was a bad boy. He was a hooligan. That's how he likes to present himself. There's also a moment in first person in the book that was published in 2000, where one of his former KGB officers, instructors, is quoted. And in the book, they said that he had a lowered sense of danger. And that wasn't thought of as a good thing. You know, they felt that, you know, a KGB officer needed to have a very kind of heightened sense of risk. But at least Putin likes to present himself as someone that doesn't fear risk, that is not easily deterred. Now, obviously, a lot of these things, you know, even propaganda is revealing in the sense that it shows you how someone wants to be perceived. And I think that's how Putin wants to be perceived when it comes to wartime. He discusses the crackdown in Chechnya in the late 90s, and says really, you know, his attitude toward Russia's enemies was, if you become jittery, you know, your enemies will think that they are stronger. And the only thing that works in those circumstances is to go on the offensive. He writes that you have to hit first, and hit so hard that your opponent will not be able to rise to his feet. This is how Putin wants to be perceived when the country is at war.